Hello, and welcome back to Bitchy History, the show where we dig through the archives, ruin a few comforting myths, and occasionally emerge from the historical swamp with a stronger sense of purpose, a worse attitude, and at least one new reason to yell at a textbook. I'm Professor Meredith, and today we are talking about Gerda Lerner. And if your immediate response to that is, wait, who? Then congratulations, you have just stumbled directly upon the point of this episode. Because Gerda Lerner is one of those people whose name should be everywhere. She should be one of those historians that people casually reference at dinner parties, if you're the kind of person that references historians at dinner parties. Because Gerda Lerner did something both massive and deeply inconvenient. She helped invent the field of women's history. Not in the sense that women did not have history before her, obviously. Women had been out there existing, working, birthing, resisting, organizing, writing, surviving, and occasionally making everyone else's lives possible since the beginning of human society. But for a very long time, the discipline of history looked at all of that and said, interesting. Anyway, let's talk about another war. Lerner helped change that. She didn't just add women into the existing story like someone sprinkling parsley on a plate of patriarchal meatloaf. She changed the structure of the story itself. She asked who got to decide what counted as history, whose lives were treated as historically meaningful, and why entire categories of human experience had been shoved into a junk drawer labeled private life. And that matters. It matters because history is not just a list of things that happened before we were born. History is how societies explain themselves to themselves. It tells us what is normal, what is possible, what is inevitable, what is natural, what is worth fighting for, and what we're supposed to quietly accept because apparently some man in a powdered wig once wrote it down and now we all have to pretend that settles the matter. Gerda Lerner was not interested in that pretending, and for that alone, we owe her a debt. I'm Professor Meredith, and this is Gerda Lerner and the Invention of Women's History, or The Day History Got Caught Lying.
Something that's, kind of bitchy.
Bitchy?
Pretty bitchy.
Bitchy? I know.
Great, keep that bitchy energy.
Well, first of all, you're a little bitchy. That's next level bitchy.
Alright, so before we get properly into the history, I want to do something that I don't always do in these episodes, which is bring myself into it a little bit more directly. Not because this needs to become diary hour. Nobody asked for, dear listener, today my nervous system and I are filing separate complaints. But because the more I think about Gerda Lerner, the more I realize that her work lands differently when you understand that history is not just academic, it's emotional, it's political, it's survival equipment. A lot of these episodes began in one form or another as lectures, and when you teach, especially in a university classroom, you get used to certain modes of speaking. You show up prepared, you explain the material, you contextualize the readings, you answer questions. You try to make the 19th century feel slightly less like a room full of dust and old hats. You keep the feelings contained. Knowledge over here, feelings over there. Please do not let the undergraduates see the machinery smoking behind the curtain. And honestly, that mode is really useful sometimes. There's a reason academic distance exists. Sometimes it helps us think clearly. Sometimes it keeps us from collapsing into the material. Sometimes it lets us say complicated things without becoming a puddle under the podium. But this isn't a classroom, and you are not a group of undergraduates trying to remember whether this will be on the exam. So I'm trying, very consciously, to let these episodes breathe a little differently, to let my presence sit inside the work, not because I think my personal life is the point, but because the reason this history matters is not abstract. I had a really rough stretch mentally lately, one of those periods where everything flattens, where the world loses color, where eating feels optional in a way that gravity feels optional if you are thinking about making very deeply unwise decisions. Where moving from one room to another feels like a major expedition requiring funding, planning, and possibly a small team of emotionally literate Sherpas. And then, because the brain is a ridiculous little haunted walnut, a few days later the fog lifted just enough and suddenly I had ideas again. I wanted to write, I wanted to research, I wanted to work, I wanted to do things, I wanted to throw myself back into the archive like the 20th century personally insulted me, which, to be honest, it usually does. The weirdest part, at least for me, is not always the feeling itself. It's the lack of language while you're inside it. You know something is wrong. You know something feels off. You know the math of your own life has stopped adding up correctly. But without the language, without a framework, without some kind of map, it becomes very easy to turn that confusion inward. Maybe I'm just lazy. Maybe I'm dramatic. Maybe I am a failure. Maybe everyone else got the instruction manual and I was sick that day. And that's where Gerda Lerner matters, because one of the things she understood better than almost anyone was that people can live inside systems that wound them and still not have the language to describe the wound. They can feel the friction. They can feel the exhaustion. They can know something is unfair, unnatural, unbearable, or wrong, but if they don't have history, if they don't have concepts, if they don't have the precedent, the system gets to disappear behind the curtain. And once the system disappears, the suffering just looks personal. That's a neat little trick for society to play, a brutal one. If women are denied their own history, each woman is forced to experience her frustration as if she invented it, as if she's the first one to be tired, the first one to be angry, the first one to feel trapped inside a life that somebody else has declared natural. And once you think the problem is just you, the structure never has to defend itself. So with that in mind, let's talk about Gerda Lerner, the woman who looked at the discipline of history and said, in essence, no, actually the silence is part of the crime scene. History has a branding problem. Ask most people what history is, and they will usually reach for the greatest hits. Dates, wars, presidents, treaties, elections, revolutions, empires, colonization, decolonization, men in wigs making decisions that somehow still manage to inconvenience us centuries later. And yes, technically all of that is history. But history is not just what happened. History is what got recorded, what got preserved, what got taught, what got repeated, what got funded, what got archived, what got placed at the center of the story, and what got shoved into the margins with the academic equivalent of, we'll circle back to that later, which, as we all know, is usually where ideas go to die. History is not neutral, it is built. And like anything built, it reflects the people who had the tools, the money, the authority, and the institutional power to decide what mattered. So when we say women were left out of history, that phrasing can make it sound accidental, almost charmingly negligent, as if history was packing for a trip, forgot women on the kitchen counter, and only realized it sometime around 1972. But Lerner understood that this was not forgetfulness, it was structure. For centuries, the people most able to preserve their papers, publish their accounts, shape institutions, define evidence, and decide what counted as public significance were men, usually men with property, men with education, with citizenship, with access to the law, the church, the university, the state, the archive, and the leisure to write things down instead of, say, keeping 8 children alive and making soup out of moral obligation and root vegetables. So the discipline of history developed around male experience, and then had the audacity to call that universal. Men's wars were history. Men's political theories were history. Men's property disputes were history. Men's letters to other men about how women were irrational were tragically very often history. Meanwhile, women's labor, women's political organizing, women's bodily experiences, women's writing, women's rituals, women's survival strategies, informal networks, intellectual lives, these were all treated as secondary, private, domestic, emotional, anecdotal, not serious, which is a very efficient way of making half the species look historically decorative. Gerda Lerner saw this clearly. In her 1971 essay, Women's Rights and American Feminism, she wrote that American historians had paid scant, almost absent-minded attention to the history of women. That phrase is so good, I want to put it in a little frame, and I might one day. Scant, almost absent-minded. Not always openly hostile, not always conspiratorial, not always some villain in a cape twirling their mustache standing at the archive door yelling "No women allowed." Sometimes it was worse than that. It was casual, normalized. It was the kind of neglect that gets mistaken for objectivity because nobody in the room has had to notice it yet. And that's what makes Lerner so important. She noticed. Then she made it impossible for other people not to notice, which, historically speaking, is how you become very annoying in the best possible way. One of Lerner's most important interventions was deceptively simple. She refused to accept the premise that women were less historically significant. That may sound obvious now, but it was not obvious inside a discipline that had spent generations defining significance in ways that conveniently favored the things men were more likely to do, control, or write down. This is the little trap door hidden under traditional history. If you define politics only as formal office holding, then women look apolitical. If you define labor only as paid labor, then women's work disappears. If you define intellectual history only through published treatises, universities, and officially recognized thinkers, then women's ideas are downgraded before they even enter the room. If you define power as law, war, and statecraft, then the home becomes scenery instead of a political institution. And then, after building all of those definitions, traditional history turns around and says, well, wait, where are the women? I don't know, Greg. Maybe under the pile of categories you designed specifically to erase them? Lerner's genius was not that she changed the question. She didn't ask, how can we squeeze women into the existing story? She asked, what is wrong with the existing story that made women appear marginal in the first place? And that shift is everything. Because once you ask that question, different evidence starts to matter. Domestic labor, childbearing, marriage, sexuality, teaching, nursing, community organizing, letters, diaries, recipes, household accounts, church groups, mutual aid networks, the kitchen, the bedroom, the classroom, the sick room, the neighborhood, the factory floor, the nursery, the abolitionist meeting, the suffrage club, the sewing circle, the reform society. Suddenly, these are not side rooms off the grand hallway of history. They are the history. In The Female Experience, Lerner built a documentary history around women's lives as they were actually lived. Childhood, work, marriage, motherhood, politics, sexuality, aging, autonomy, constraint, resistance. She didn't just structure the story around men's institutions and then sprinkle in women wherever she could make them look relevant. She changed the entire framework. And when you change the frame, you change the evidence. When you change the evidence, you change the story. And when you change the story, you change what people can understand about themselves. That's one of the reasons Lerner's work still feels so powerful to me. She doesn't just say, actually, women were there. She says, you were taught to value the wrong things. And that hits a lot harder, because a lot of us know what it feels like to have our labor minimized because it didn't look dramatic enough, to have our pain dismissed because it happened in private, to have our intelligence questioned because it didn't arrive in the approved packaging, to have our survival treated as ordinary because nobody wanted to admit how much work it took. Lerner gives us a way to say no, the problem was never that these lives lacked meaning. The problem was that history had been trained not to see that meaning. And this is where Lerner went from important historian to intellectual threat, because she didn't just stop at inclusion. Inclusion is nice. Inclusion is necessary. Inclusion is also often where institutions like to stop because it lets them keep the furniture exactly where it is while adding one tasteful portrait of a woman in the hallway. Lerner wanted more than that. She didn't just simply ask, can women be added to history? She said, what does women's exclusion tell us about the structure of historical knowledge itself? And that question is dangerous. That question starts peeling at the wallpaper in a way that Charlotte Perkins Gilman would really, really love. In The Majority Finds Its Past, Lerner argues that women's history is not just a separate topic. It is a way of seeing what traditional history has obscured. Obscured. Not accidentally misplaced. Not waited patiently in another folder. Obscured. That's an intentional word. The old model of history treated male experience as human experience. Men's public lives became the default map of civilization. Men's institutions became the central plot. Men's ambition became political history. Men's wars became turning points. Men's writings became intellectual tradition. And men's records became the evidence. And then the discipline stood back, admired its own handiwork, and called it universal. Lerner broke that spell. She showed that what had been presented as neutral was actually a perspective, a powerful perspective, an entrenched one with tenure, funding, and very confident speaking voices, but still just a perspective. And once you know that, the whole thing kind of starts to wobble. You start asking rude questions. Whose life is being treated as normal? Why? Whose work is being treated as background? Why? Who gets to be an actor in history, and who gets reduced to the atmosphere in the room? Who is remembered as a thinker, and who is remembered as a thinker's wife, sister, daughter, muse, assistant, or influence, which is academic code for we are not emotionally prepared to admit that she did most of the work. This is why women's history is not just additive. It is disruptive. It changes the method. It changes the archive, the questions we ask, and the assumptions we're allowed to make. It forces history to admit that it's supposed to be neutral, but has often been an elaborate costume. And frankly, the costume was never that good. Once Lerner exposes the silence, she turns to the machinery that produced it, because if women were erased from recorded history, we have to ask what kind of system made that erasure possible. What had to be built materially and ideologically for male dominance to appear natural? What stories had to be told? What laws had to be written? What bodies had to be controlled? What symbols of religion, family, economics, and educational systems had to work together to make hierarchy look like common sense? And that is where her book, The Creation of Patriarchy, enters the chat carrying a flamethrower and a bibliography. Lerner's argument is not that patriarchy means that men were mean. It's not just bad vibes with property rights. It's not simply men being in charge because everyone woke up one morning and collectively decided that women were better suited to unpaid labor, reproductive coercion, legal dependency, and being told to smile more. Patriarchy for Lerner is a historically constructed system. It's rooted in men's control over women's sexuality, reproduction, labor, and social meaning. That matters because it moves us away from the fluffy nonsense version of patriarchy as a misunderstanding or a personality problem or some unfortunate residue of old-fashioned manners. Patriarchy is organized power. Law, property, marriage, inheritance, religion, myth, education, everything. It's who gets to speak for God, who gets to own land, who gets to inherit wealth, who gets to control children, who gets to define morality, and who gets punished for stepping outside the approved role. And one of Lerner's most important points is that patriarchy is not only external. It's not just something imposed from the outside by police, priests, husbands, fathers, lawmakers, and every man who has ever had the audacity to explain your own field to you at a volume that suggests his confidence is load-bearing. It also shapes consciousness. It shapes what people believe is natural. It shapes what people think is possible. It shapes what people understand as moral, rational, respectable, feminine, masculine, holy, shameful, admirable, or grotesque. By the time something has been embedded that deeply into culture, challenging it is not simply a political act. It's an epistemological one, which is a fancy way of saying it changes how we know what we know. And that's where Lerner becomes so useful. She understands that naming a structure is not a small thing. Naming a structure is sometimes the first crack in the wall. Because if patriarchy was created, then it's not destiny. If it was built, it can be dismantled. If it had a history, it can have an ending. And that's the kind of sentence that sounds simple until you realize whole civilizations have been organized around preventing people from believing it. One of the reasons that Lerner remains so valuable is that she does not make this easy. She didn't give us a version of history where women are always noble resistors and patriarchy is something that only ever happens to them from the outside. That would be simpler. It would also be worse history. Lerner asks a harder question. How does a system like patriarchy endure for centuries? Force is part of the answer, obviously. Law, violence, economic dependency, religious authority, exclusion from education, control over reproduction, punishment for disobedience, social shame, the whole charming gift basket. But force alone is not enough to explain endurance. Systems last when people learn to live inside them, when they negotiate with them, when they adapt and make bargains, when they find pockets of safety, status, belonging, authority, or survival inside arrangements that they did not create. Lerner wanted to understand women's cooperation in the process of their own subordination. That is an uncomfortable phrase. It should be. But it's not victim blaming, it's system analysis. Because people don't survive oppressive systems by standing outside them in morally pure little meadows untouched by compromise. That's not how power works. People survive by making choices within the constraints that they live in. Sometimes terrible constraints. Sometimes constraints so normalized that they don't even look like constraints when you're in them. Women have often participated in patriarchal systems because participation offered protection, status, respectability, religious belonging, family approval, economic survival, or the possibility of some limited power over others. That doesn't make the system less violent. It just makes it more complicated. And it helps explain why oppressive systems don't need everyone to love them. They only need people to find them normal, or inevitable, or safer than the alternative, or just too risky to challenge. This is one of the places where Lerner stops just being useful to understanding history, but becomes useful for understanding the present, because we still see this everywhere. Women defend systems that restrict them all the time. People harmed by hierarchy cling to hierarchy because it gives them a script, a role, a recognizable place in the world. And I get it, up to a point. I don't say that cheerfully. I say it with the weary facial expression of someone who has spent too much time watching people decorate their own cages and call it tradition. But I do understand that people build emotional lives inside of systems. They build families, identities, theologies, communities, a sense of self. If you ask them to question the system, you're not just asking them to change their politics. You're asking them to question the story that made their life feel like something they were proud of. And that's hard. It's also necessary. And Lerner gives us tools for holding both truths at once. The system is violent, and the people inside it are complicated. History, as usual, refuses to become emotionally convenient. It's very rude of it, but here we are. And this brings us to one of Gerda Lerner's most important ideas, the feminist consciousness. And this is where her work becomes, for me, almost painfully intimate, because feminist consciousness is not magic. It's not a switch that flips. It's not a vibe. It's not something you absorb by owning enough tote bags with angry slogans on them, though that would be nice if that worked that way. I am certainly not here to discourage the tote bag economy. Feminist consciousness is built. It begins with experience. Something feels wrong. Something feels unfair. something feels unlivable. It keeps happening, and everyone insists it's normal, but your body knows before your vocabulary does that something is very wrong. But without language, that feeling stays private. Without history, it feels isolated. Without framework, it turns into shame. You think the problem is you, your marriage, your workplace, your family, your body, your ambition, your exhaustion, your inability to cope with what everyone else has coped with for centuries. Your failure to be grateful for the life you were told should satisfy you. And then history enters the chat. Not politely. History kicks the door open and says, actually, this has a pattern, it's not just you. That's feminist consciousness. It is the moment that private pain becomes historical understanding. It's the moment a woman realizes that what she thought was a personal defect might actually be a political condition. It's the moment I am failing becomes I am being asked to survive something impossible and then thank the system for the opportunity. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Lerner argued that women's relationship to history helps explain both their long subordination and the development of feminist thought. If women are cut off from their own past, they are cut off from precedent. And precedent matters. Without precedent, every generation has to rediscover the problems from scratch. Without precedent, every woman who feels trapped thinks she feels trapped alone. Without precedent, every demand for freedom can be framed as unnatural, excessive, selfish, or new. And that is why women's history isn't decorative. It's not an academic equivalent of a themed month. It's not, and now, for diversity, we will discuss a lady for once. Women's history is a survival archive. It teaches us that other people have felt this pressure before. Other people have named it. Other people have resisted it. Other people have failed, tried again, compromised, fought, written, organized, mourned, and imagined something better. Sometimes the difference between despair and action is having a name for the thing. Sometimes the difference between shame and clarity is realizing you are not the first person to feel the walls closing in. Sometimes history doesn't save you by giving you an answer. It just saves you by proving that you aren't crazy. And honestly, some days that's all you need. Lerner's work on Sarah and Angelina Grimke is one of the best places to see feminist consciousness as a process rather than a personality trait. The Grimke sisters were not born into radical feminist clarity. They were born into a wealthy slave-holding family in South Carolina. They were raised inside hierarchy, white supremacy, patriarchy, and religious authority. They inherited a world that explained itself very confidently and very wrongly. And they had to fight their way out of it. Not all at once. They didn't wake up one morning as fully formed reformers with perfect politics and excellent pamphlet structure. They had to observe, read, question, argue, refuse, revise, leave, think, change. They had to become people capable of naming the systems that had shaped them. And that matters, because we often talk about political consciousness as if it's a moral essence, as if some people are simply born enlightened and others are born as walking comment sections. But Lerner understood consciousness as work. Sarah Grimke, in particular, became for Lerner a major feminist thinker, not just a supporting character in abolitionist history. She was not simply involved, she was theorizing. She was making arguments about women's rights, authority, equality, and the moral contradictions of the world that she had inherited. And Lerner emphasized that feminist consciousness had to be acquired by conscious effort. I love that phrase, conscious effort, because it refuses the fantasy that awareness just happens to us. It takes work to see clearly in a world designed to blur the edges. It takes discipline to notice that what you have been taught not to notice. It takes courage to admit that the story you inherited may have been serving power more than truth. And that takes repetition. That part is extremely fucking annoying, but true. You don't simply achieve clarity once and then live there forever in a tasteful apartment with good lighting. You have to return to it, practice it, rebuild it, remind yourself, read, talk, think, rest, get angry, get specific, get less impressed by systems that rely on your confusion. And this is where, for me, Lerner's work becomes much more than just historiography, because clarity is not always a feeling. Sometimes clarity is a practice. Sometimes you don't feel brave, but you build language anyway. Sometimes you don't feel hopeful, but you keep reading. Sometimes you don't feel powerful, but you learn the structure of the thing pressing on you, and that knowledge becomes a handhold. Lerner understood that consciousness works historically too. Women don't simply wake up free because the vibes have improved. They build freedom through knowledge, memory, collective recognition, and the stubborn refusal to let power define reality in an uncontested way. Which isn't glamorous, but it is how work gets done. Now, one of the things that makes Lerner worth returning to is that she does not treat women as a single, tidy, universal category. She was writing before the term intersectionality became something that many of us now use, and later feminist scholars would absolutely expand, challenge, and complicate parts of her work. That's how scholarship works when it's alive and not being preserved in amber by people who think that footnotes are a personality. But Lerner was already clear that women do not all experience power the same way. Race matters, class matters, sexuality matters, education matters. Labor, citizenship, relationship to the state, relationship to property, relationship to empire, slavery, colonialism, migration, and religion. It all matters. There is no single female experience floating above history in a sensible, neutral cardigan, and any feminism that pretends middle-class white women's experiences are universal is not liberatory. It's just another machine for distortion, this time with better branding. Lerner understood that women could be oppressed by patriarchy while also benefiting from white supremacy, class privilege, colonial power, or other forms of domination. That matters because it prevents us from turning women's history into a comfort object. Women are not automatically virtuous because they are women. Women can resist power. Women can reproduce power. Women can be victims of one hierarchy and beneficiaries of another. Women can be brave, cruel, visionary, limited, brilliant, compromised, selfish, generous, radical, conservative, trapped, strategic, and wildly inconvenient to anyone who wants a clean moral chart. In other words, inconveniently, women are people. It's terrible news for anyone hoping that history would get more simple. This is one of the reasons that Lerner still feels useful even where later scholars improve on her. She was not trying to build a feminism that made anyone feel neat and tidy. She was trying to build an analysis that could survive contact with reality. And reality is really fucking messy. It doesn't care about our preferred narratives. It doesn't stop producing contradictions just because we have a deadline to meet. One of the most annoying habits in contemporary discourse is the rush to flatten everything into teams of good and bad people, as if history is a school assembly and someone is about to hand out certificates for moral consistency. Lerner doesn't let us do that. She asks us to look at structure. Sometimes that means seeing women as excluded, silenced, exploited, and controlled. But it also sometimes means seeing women as participants in systems that harmed other women. Sometimes it means seeing both at once, which is considerably harder. But harder isn't the same thing as less true. By the time Lerner writes the book Why History Matters and Living with History, Making Social Change, the stakes of her work are completely explicit. History matters because it shapes consciousness. It shapes what people think is possible, what they think has precedent, what they imagine can be changed, and what they accept as natural. It shapes what they recognize as oppression and what they misread as personal failure. This is why history is never just about the past. I know that sounds like one of those lines historians say because we are contractually obligated to remind everyone that our field is relevant. Please fund the humanities, we are begging you. But it is true. History is one of the ways that societies build reality. If you are told that patriarchy is eternal, resistance looks futile. If you are told that women have always been naturally subordinate, equality looks fake. If you are told that family has always looked one way, every alternative looks like decline. And if you're told that women have no tradition of political thought, then every feminist demand can be dismissed as a modern overreaction. If you're told that the present is natural, you are less likely to ask who benefits from calling it that. Historical knowledge interrupts inevitability. That is its power. It tells us that the present was made, and that if it was made, it can be remade. That doesn't mean change is ever easy. Please don't misunderstand me. History is not a motivational poster with archival citations. There are no inspirational sunsets here. There is struggle, backlash, failure, organizing, compromise, exhaustion, and the occasional urge to scream into a decorative pillow. But history gives us orientation. It gives us precedent. It gives us a way to say that this has happened before. People have resisted before. Systems have changed. The story we inherited is not the only one available. And sometimes that matters more than we know. If you have ever clung to a book, an idea, a lecture, a speech, a poem, television episode, or one very specific sentence that arrived at exactly the right moment and made you feel less alone, then you already understand this. Sometimes what saves you is not a solution. Sometimes it is recognition, a pattern, a name, and knowledge that somewhere else someone has walked into the fog, left markers behind, and said, "Here, this is where the ground drops, so you can avoid it." Gerda Lerner spent her career giving women those markers. She gave women a past that had been denied to them, and by doing that, she gave them more than history. She gave them tools. Gerda Lerner did not just add women to history. She made history explain itself. She asked why a discipline that claimed to study humanity had mistaken men's experience for the human condition. She asked why women's labor, bodies, ideas, relationships, and resistance had been treated as marginal when they were central to every society that has ever existed. She asked why domestic life had been dismissed as private when it was one of the main places power was organized and reproduced. She asked what happens when women are cut off from their own past. And then she gave us the answer. What happens is that every generation has to start over and over and over again. Every woman is made to feel alone. Every demand for freedom is treated as new, strange, excessive, and unnatural. Every structure of domination gets to present itself as timeless. Lerner refused that. She showed that patriarchy was built, not ordained by God. She showed that women's absence from the archive was political, not natural. She showed that feminist consciousness had to be created through language, memory, history, and collective recognition. She showed that recovering women's past is not some sentimental pastime. It is political. Because if women have no history, then power gets to lie about them forever. If women have no precedent, then every act of resistance looks like an aberration. If women have no usable past, then the systems that harmed them get to masquerade as destiny. And Gerda Lerner was not having it. She forced history to admit that it had been partial, arrogant, selective, and deeply invested in confusing male experience with universal truth. And honestly, good. History had it coming. I love that Lerner was difficult. I love that she asked questions the discipline did not want to answer. I love that she understood history not as a dead record, but as a living force that shapes what people believe about themselves. And if I'm being honest, that's what I hope this show does too. Not in some grand self-important way. I'm not standing here in a velvet cape declaring myself the people's archivist. Although now that I've said that, I kind of see the appeal. But in the sense that maybe history can help us name our own lives more clearly. Maybe it can help us recognize the structures we have been taught to mistake for personal failure. Maybe it can remind us that the present is not inevitable. It can hand us a flashlight and say, look again, there's a road ahead. Because sometimes learning what other people survived, named, challenged, and changed does not magically fix anything, but it does make the dark look a little bit less total. And lately, I think I needed that reminder. So Gerda Lerner, thank you for the framework. Thank you for the language. Thank you for making the archives sweat a little bit. Thank you for being an absolute menace to bad history. And thank you all for listening. This has been Bitchy History, where the past is never as dead as people want it to be, and neither are the women they tried to leave out of it.
History.
History. History. History.
History.
What a bitch, right?